All right, Jim, what are we doing today?
Today, Duncan, we are doing 51 signs that your team might not be doing Scrum.
Okay, I'm fired up for this.
Get in.
If you think Scrum is just about moving post-it notes, then you're not doing Scrum.
If you're using this framework to micromanage your team, that's not Scrum.
And if you're using the daily Scrum just to get some kind of status report on what everyone's working on, then you're not really doing Scrum.
If you have release sprints or testing sprints, that's not Scrum.
And if you're doing a sprint 0 before you start your real sprints, then you're not really doing Scrum.
It's not Scrum if you think the aim of sprint planning is to come up with a fixed plan for the whole sprint.
And if your product owner is allocating work to the team during sprint planning, then you're not doing Scrum.
It's called the daily Scrum for a reason. If you're not having the Scrum every day, you're not doing Scrum.
And if you skip your sprint review because you didn't get anything done, then you're not doing Scrum.
And it's not Scrum if you're skipping the sprint review because your stakeholders don't turn up.
And if you're skipping the sprint retrospective because the team don't have anything to talk about, or if the team just don't think they can improve, then you're not doing Scrum.
Scrum events are time-boxed and focused. If the events seem to just be going on and on and on, that's probably not Scrum.
And if you're using Scrum as if it's a complete methodology, then you're not really doing Scrum.
Sprints finish when the time box expires. If your sprints go on until all of the work is done, that isn't Scrum.
And if you're getting stuff done, but not tested or not completely finished within your sprints, then you're not really doing Scrum.
Sprints in Scrum are less than 1 calendar month to minimize risk. If your sprints are more than 1 calendar month, it's not Scrum.
And if you're treating your velocity as a target that the team have to achieve every single sprint, then you're not really doing Scrum.
If management is dictating to the team how much work they must get done in a sprint, that's not Scrum.
And if you're expecting to get a perfect plan out of sprint planning, which you're going to stick to for the rest of the sprint without changing, that's not really Scrum.
Daily Scrum is by the developers, for the developers. If your Scrum Master or your product owner feels that it's their job to run the daily Scrum, that's not Scrum.
And if the developers think they're being managed during the daily Scrum, then that's not Scrum.
If you end the sprint with a demo or a show and tell or something without any stakeholders present, that's not gathering feedback and that's not Scrum.
And if management or stakeholders are attending the sprint retrospective, then you're not doing Scrum.
Do you have a Scrum team without a Scrum Master?
Or do you have a Scrum team without a product owner?
Or do you have a committee acting as a product owner?
And if you have a proxy product owner because the real product owner is too busy, then you're not doing Scrum.
It's not Scrum if your team lack the skills between them to get the work done.
And if you have team leads, you're not doing Scrum.
And you're not doing Scrum if the team just do as they're told.
And if the developers are being micromanaged to ensure that they're productive every minute of every hour of every day, you're not really doing Scrum.
Scrum teams have the autonomy to decide what they do and how they do it. If your team doesn't get that autonomy, then your team isn't doing Scrum.
And if the team are being reprimanded just because they don't hit burn down targets, they're not doing Scrum.
If your Scrum team needs constant supervision, it's not doing Scrum.
And if you think your Scrum Master needs to facilitate all of the Scrum events and all of your meetings, then you're not really doing Scrum.
If you think that every team is the same and that processes should be standardized, that's not Scrum.
And if you don't have a clearly ordered product backlog, then you're not doing Scrum.
Scrum teams have a product goal. No product goal, not Scrum.
And if sometimes you don't bother with a sprint goal because you think it's optional, then you're not really doing Scrum.
Scrum teams have a transparent definition of done. If it's not a transparent definition of done, you're not doing Scrum.
Developers on a Scrum team own their own sprint backlog and frequently update it whenever they find new information. If the developers don't feel like the sprint backlog is theirs, then you're not really doing Scrum.
The developers are allowed to add and remove work from the sprint backlog in order to meet the sprint goal. If they're not given the freedom to add and remove work as they see fit, you're not doing Scrum.
And if the team feel that they can't fail or occasionally admit that things are more complex than they originally thought, then you're not really doing Scrum.
Velocity is a measure of how much work the team got done. If management treat velocity as a measure of value, you're not doing Scrum.
And if your team are producing a poor quality product that's full of defects and bugs, and they're not being transparent about it, and they're not fixing it, your team aren't doing Scrum.
Or if your team are introducing technical debt and knowingly not paying it back, that's not Scrum.
Or if your team are giving estimates, which are then being treated as commitments, you're not really doing Scrum.
And if you think Scrum is a cookbook that you can simply pick and choose from, that's not doing Scrum.
And if your team aren't being fully transparent about the problems that they discovered along the way, you're not doing Scrum.
And Scrum requires that teams inspect and adapt frequently. If your team aren't inspecting and adapting every day, that's not Scrum either.
And if your team aren't constantly looking to improve their processes, tools, technology, and teamwork, your team aren't really doing Scrum. Cue credits.
So Duncan, that was 51 things that aren't Scrum. What are 51 things that are Scrum?
Oh no, not that.
Not that. Obviously not that. Not that. It's not Scrum. It's just not Scrum.
It's just not.
It's just not Scrum. What can I tell you, guys? Just turn the video off now. Accept it. Seriously.